This new electric vehicle tax credit revision as part of the Inflation Reduction Act changes a lot of things for new car buyers. For a lot of us, it makes the prospect of buying our first electric car a lot more affordable, but for other people, it doesn't help them at all. Let's talk about this new act, its rules, what vehicles you can actually buy as part of this, and whether or not the act actually applies to you, or if you're excluded from anybody who could potentially benefit from it. One thing that surprised me about it in doing research was that it doesn't just apply to electric-only vehicles. It also can apply to some plug-in hybrid electric. So that opens the door for this tax credit for those of us that aren't quite ready to go full electric yet. All right, let's get into this new act and its rules. In the Inflation Reduction Act as a whole, there are 700 plus pages. Thankfully, only a small chunk of it actually applies to EVs and tax credits. Buyers of new EVs can get a tax credit of up to $7,500. That's the same as the previous law. But one big difference with this one is that it can also apply to used vehicles. But there's rules around that. So the tax credit itself is $4,000 or 30% of the sales price, whichever is less. You also can't buy the car at the dealership, and it can't be basically like 1 year old. It's got to be older than that. But we'll get into more of the vehicle rules here in a minute. Most of these big changes for us come in January 1st, 2023. And one of those big limits we have to look out for are income limits. Or at least, I guess some people have to look out for income limits. If you want to buy a new EV and you're an individual, kiss that tax credit goodbye if you earn more than $150,000 per year. If you file as head of household and you want a new EV, $225,000 is the limit, and if you're married filing jointly, $300,000 is the limit. And remember, this is just for new cars. For used cars, the income limits are a lot less. For an individual filer wanting to buy a used car, that limit is $75,000. For a head of household wanting to buy a used EV, that's $112,500. And for married filing jointly wanting to buy a used EV, $150,000 is the cap. So it's still very high, and that means that most of us can get this tax credit. But for those of you that make more money than that, you're out of luck, starting January 1st. But there is still hope for those of you who have a higher income than that, and we'll talk about that right now. If you act before the end of this year, 2022, those income limits don't apply. An important note, though, is that if you want to do that, you have to pick only vehicles that have final assembly in North America. If you're like me, how the heck do you know where a car was finally assembled? Like, I have no idea. Thankfully, there's this website that I'll put in the description that you can type in the VIN number of the car and see where it was finally assembled to know, okay, the last little bit of it was assembled here. That means we can buy it and get this tax credit. Another catch for those of you with too high of incomes who are trying to force this in the last quarter of 2022 is that there's vehicle manufacturing limits that are in place right now that will disqualify you from buying several brands. So if an automaker has already made 200,000 EVs, you just can't do it this year. You'll just be SOL. So that means no Teslas, no Toyotas, and no GMs, which that's a lot of the EV market, honestly, right now. That's kind of a bummer for you, but honestly, I don't feel that bad because if you're hurrying to buy an EV because your income is too high, $7,500 here and there shouldn't make or break the deal for you. Just go ahead and buy the car you want. But for the rest of us, let's get back to within the limits of this new law, what does the tax credit mean for us? How does it help us? Well, for one thing, leases don't count as a purchase and only purchases can get the tax credit. So if you're currently planning on leasing some car because there's a cool lease rate on that new Subaru electric car or something like that, can't do it. Leases don't count, only purchases. Also, from all the research I've done, these tax credits are what's called non-refundable tax credits, which means that they don't help you at all unless you're planning to have a tax bill come at the end of the year. So if you don't expect to have a tax bill where you owe the government at least as much as what the tax credit is, then it's not actually going to help you. For a lot of us, we have things set up to where we actually get a refund, or we might owe the government a little bit of money. But in this case, whenever they're giving you this credit back to say hey, we're going to wipe out the amount of taxes you owe us up to this amount, if you don't owe them any money, you don't benefit from the credit. Now, the difference would be if these were refundable tax credits, because that would mean that even if you owed the government zero money on April 15th, that you would still get that refund amount back. And so everything I've seen says that these are non-refundable. Maybe that changes in the future. Maybe I missed something. It'd be great if they were, because that would honestly open the door to most of us way open, because it means you're going to get the value of that tax credit no matter what. If they remain non-refundable, it's going to have to be either a high tax planning year for you to where you're intentionally not withholding taxes from your paycheck so that you end up with a big tax bill that then you'll wipe out with this credit. Kind of a gamble. You better make sure you're going to get the credit, or it just means that, hey, let's just not even worry about this. It's too complicated. It's not going to happen for us, and let's move on. There's a chance I'm wrong. There's a chance this changes in the future, so let's wait and see. Don't feel bad if that whole tax part was a little bit kind of shady to you, because it was to me too. Just know this, a tax credit removes the excess amount of taxes that you would have owed to the government. So whether this applies to you or not, we have to go through both income limits. Is your income low enough to where you're not going to go ahead and hit those limits? Are you currently set up, or are you willing to set up your taxes such that you will end up owing the government at least the amount of your tax credit by the end of the year so that you can actually benefit from getting that tax credit? That's a different thing than most of us do right now. Most of us aren't planning on owing the government money, so you have to be willing to do that. That's thing number 2. And then thing number 3 is about to come in here in this next section of the video, which is, are you willing to jump through the hoops to buy the right car? Because very few electric vehicles apply for this right now because of how the manufacturing rules are set up. So let's talk about the kind of cars that are applicable to this new tax credit. As of right this moment, for the rest of 2022, any manufacturer who's already sold over 200,000 EVs cannot get this tax credit for you. So that means Tesla, GM, and Toyota are off the table. But that all changes in 2023 when those limits are removed. Now, speaking of limits, let's talk about the vehicle price limits that are caps on the maximum you can spend on these vehicles and expect to get this EV tax credit. For new electric cars, that limit is $55,000. For new electric trucks, SUVs, and vans, that price limit is $80,000. Now, I've never bought a vehicle that's that expensive personally, but a lot of EVs are more money than gas cars, so that means this is a real limiting factor for you. For a lot of us, the more appealing option will be used electric cars, but there's price caps on that too. For used EVs, the price limit is $25,000, plus the car has to be 2 years old or more, plus it has to be bought from a dealer. That last tip is really important to pay attention to because it means you can't buy your cousin's Tesla Model 3 and get this tax credit and then sell it back to him and he gets a tax credit and there's this infinite loop of tax credits. It's not going to work like that. You've got to buy it from a dealer, which means in most states you've got to pay sales tax, and so it's a little bit more hoops to jump through, if you will. But $25,000 is pretty cheap, and you can find those cars out there. I think that there's a decent selection, and that selection's only going to grow, but the fact is that a lot of us now are going to be looking for $20,000 to $25,000 used EVs that are at least 2 years old and at a dealership. You might want to watch out for dealerships jacking up their prices of every used EV to $24,999 because they know these rules too. Another important thing to remember is that this is the final price of the car. So if you're speccing out a new car or a new electric truck or something like that, you can't just use the base MSRP. Something like a Ford Lightning has a pretty reasonable base MSRP. It was like $40,000, it might be more than that now, but by the time you get into like an XLT or get an extended range battery up in the $55,000, $60,000 range, and that would apply because it's well under 80 grand. But if you start getting into a Platinum and a bunch of options and things like that, it's possible to exceed that maximum price. So you have to be careful how you spec each vehicle that you're looking at if you're going to potentially spend more than the limit, because it's not the base price, it's that final price that you pay. And here comes probably the most tricky part, because it's not just enough that you have to meet income limits and vehicle price limits and these other things. There's limits on where the batteries are made, where the car is finally assembled, and all this. So let's get into that now. For the year 2023, a lot of these manufacturing limits will not be in place yet. So that could be a really sweet spot to buy an EV, because after that, things get a little bit crazy. The rules state that EVs with battery components that are sourced from foreign entities of concern, which a big example of that is China, will no longer qualify from the tax credit. So that's anything that's put in service after December 31st, 2023, which is starting January 1st, 2024. There's starting some big requirements as far as where the batteries are produced. To be eligible for that tax credit, starting in 2024, 40% of the materials have to be either sourced from North America or from a U.S. trading partner. And then that ramps up over time, because by 2029, that number has to be 100% sourced in America or an American trading partner. There's this group called the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, and they looked at all the available vehicles that are being produced right now that could potentially apply for this tax credit. According to that group, right now there's 72 EVs that are sold in America that would potentially comply with this tax credit. And that's both plug-in hybrids that could apply and strictly electric cars that could apply. Of all 72 cars that you could choose from, 70% of them will be ineligible starting 2023. And by 2029, whenever that ramps up to needing to be 100% of battery materials sourced here or by our trading partners, none of those cars apply. Now you might be saying, well, 2029 is a long way away. That's a long time for someone to decide to get parts from China and move it to wherever, and they should be able to do that, right? I mean, in theory, yes, but the problem is that automotive manufacturing, the little I know of it, is extremely complex. There's a million moving parts, and it's really, really difficult to change operations like that. And they're obviously incentivized to do it, but they're going to do that math, and they're going to figure out, based on our projections of the number of people who are going to buy these cars, based on the number of those people who are planning on really needing this tax credit to buy the car, is it worth it for us to go through that rigmarole to move our whole operation and end up where we have to end up? If it's not worth it, they don't have to change anything. They can frankly leave their manufacturing operations exactly where they are and say, hey, sorry guys, if we're going to change our operation from China to Milwaukee, you're going to have to pay $15,000 more for this car. So even if we did that, you wouldn't benefit from a $7,500 tax credit anyway. Just buy the car today and don't worry about it. Sounds like something a car manufacturer would do if you ask me. If you do still want to buy an EV or a plug-in hybrid vehicle right now and take advantage of this tax credit, what's the best strategy to go about it? Well, as I did all this research and as I read through all 700 pages of that act, no, I didn't read all 700 pages. I think based on what I understand, buying something that is new in the next year before a lot of those limits kick in as far as where the batteries are made, so that means in the calendar year 2023, buying something new that's on the cheaper end of this market. So something like a Bolt EUV, maybe a Tesla Model 3, or some other kind of base model electric vehicle means that your price probably won't go up a whole lot in the next year. It's not going to go up by $7,500. And hopefully you can jump in and grab one before a lot of supply chains may be pinched whenever they're trying to move to America or American trade partners to try and take advantage of this. That's assuming they're going to try and take advantage of it. Some of the rules and nuances of this thing are still a little bit fuzzy, and so we're going to have to wait and see how things shape out once it actually kicks in starting January 1st, 2023. I think at that point we'll get a little bit better idea of what people are actually finding when it comes to applying for the tax credit. Are they getting it? Are they not? What did they do wrong? What can we learn from their mistakes? And then how can we act? In case you want to know what I think about this, overall, like what do we think about moving manufacturing, about incentivizing people to buy this kind of vehicle, all that stuff. I'm no economist, automotive expert, or politician, but my general take is that this law is just going to fast forward a process that was already pretty inevitable. I love an internal combustion engine, and I'm a car guy myself, self-proclaimed, even though this is what we're currently driving. We're not driving a sports car, but I do love a sports car. I think that where we were headed anyway was purely EVs, and the fact that California just passed a ban on internal combustion engines starting in 2035, and Europe did a similar thing back in June of this year, means that those new vehicles that had internal combustion engines were going to have to be stopped being produced anyway, and I'm sure a lot of other states are going to follow suit because that's typically what happens with California. They pass something that sounds crazy and then everyone else ends up following along. So we're probably going to have 15 or 20 more years of potential internal combustion engine ownership before things get into like private racetrack clubs and things like that, or maybe vintage vehicles, like vintage year 2015 cars that still have a gasoline engine. So this isn't like some monumental shift from a different direction. It's just fast forwarding what was going to happen anyway. Now, will forcing the manufacturing to come from overseas to here completely like change things for the better and help everybody out and make the companies better and make our lives better? Will that all improve things? That's too complex to really nail down right now. And like I said before, I don't know that they necessarily have to move their manufacturing. Maybe they go, okay, that's nice. A few people will get the tax credit between now and 2024, but once those battery source component regulations kick in, screw it. Like, we don't need to give everyone a tax credit. They're not under the gun to force this into happening. They can just choose to ignore it. In the grand scheme of things, whether or not we buy an EV, whether or not we get a tax credit for it, and whatever the government ends up doing in Washington shouldn't have the ultimate effect on how we are financially. There's a lot that we can do to shape our future and to win with money and to make sure that we're the ones in control and we're not waiting on someone else to save us. If you want to do more of that and you want to know where to invest your money or who to invest your money with, then you should watch this video because I go over the absolute worst investing apps and companies to work with. These are confusing. They're not worth going with because it's just not worth your time. So to win with money, you got to watch that video and learn who are the easier, better, more streamlined people to invest with so that you can do that, you can grow your wealth, and it'll save you a bunch of wasted time working with the wrong people or worrying too much about EV tax credits. If you want to read more about this, I've put a bunch of links in the description, both articles and the act itself, and the lists of vehicles and the VIN decoder thing to figure out what vehicles apply, or if you need to look up one specifically in between now and 2024 to see whether it was finally assembled and all that kind of stuff. You can find all those links in the description for you really easily. I want this to be a resource for you. I want it to be something that actually helps you to make decisions. So go in the description to find all that good stuff. I almost forgot, the secret comment for this video is burnout, because that's what we do in cars sometimes. Whenever you take off or whenever you have a bunch of power in your EV, instant torque, baby, you do a burnout. Okay, see ya. Bye.